Hello again. Welcome to class 453. 453, right, Marta? Yeah. Welcome to class 453. Yesterday, I had to finish my class abruptly. Do you remember the class yesterday? I started talking about Nancy Johnson. Here you have her, Nancy Johnson. And I began. Nancy Johnson and her husband, Philip, took the day off last Friday to drive to Denver, Colorado. They drove across almost all of Nebraska and half of Colorado. And I said, to drive across. And so I decided to show you how in English we use the preposition across. Because across is a través de o atravesando. But to drive across, conducir a través de, no. Se puede conducir a través de la selva, pero eso is to drive through. But to drive across means cruzar conduciendo. We say to drive across. And so I started showing you, you remember yesterday? Yeah, I put this here. I said, this is Nebraska. And this is Colorado. Do you remember? Okay. And this is Omaha, the Missouri River. This is Lincoln, and this is Denver. And here's are the Rocky Mountains coming from Alaska, Canada, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Mexico. All right, but here we have Denver. Here we have Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. All right, here we have South Dakota and North Dakota. Fargo, North Dakota, like the película Fargo, right here. Okay, but this is Nebraska. Now, a plane coming from Chicago to Denver flies above Nebraska, of course, but it flies across. O sea, atraviesa el estado de Nebraska desde Chicago, atraviesa Nebraska, pero en vuelo, no para, no aterriza. So it flies across Nebraska. And in a car from Omaha to Denver, you need to drive across Nebraska. And so it's a long drive. From here to here is probably 7 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours. From here to here is probably 5 hours. It's a long drive. It's a long drive from Lincoln, Nebraska. But the states are next to each other. They share a common border. And I repeat, up here is South Dakota. In South Dakota, here, close to the border with Wyoming, you have Mount Rushmore. Have you ever heard of Mount Rushmore? Have you ever heard of Mount Rushmore? No. Have you ever seen Mount Rushmore? No. Have you ever seen a mountain with the faces of 4 presidents? Yeah. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, and Theodore Roosevelt. That mountain with the faces of the presidents carved in the mountain, cincelados. That's Mount Rushmore. It's right here. But here we're here. So, last Friday, Nancy Johnson and her husband Philip took the day off. Yeah. Geography lesson over. They took the day off and, ¿qué hicieron? They took the day off last Friday. They took the day off. Mañana voy a coger el día libre. Tomorrow I'm going to take the day off. Voy a coger esta tarde libre. I'm going to take this afternoon off. To take el momento off. Puede ser una semana. To take the week off. To take the day off, etc. So last Friday, they took the day off to drive to Denver, Colorado. They drove across all of Nebraska and half, la mitad de, and half of Colorado. It took them 9 hours. It took them 9 hours. They spent Friday night at the Marriott Hotel. A little bit of free advertising. El Marriott. They spent Friday night at the Marriott Hotel in Denver. The next morning, they drove up to Aspen in the mountains. The following morning, dos formas, la mañana siguiente, la próxima mañana. The next morning, they drove up to Aspen. Okay. Along endless winding roads. Winding. The long and winding road. Roads son caminos, pero caminos asfaltados en este caso, carreteras. Winding means serpenteantes, winding. Typical of mountains. Endless, sin fin. Parecía no terminar nunca. Darling, how far is it to Aspen? I don't know. It's taking forever. Estamos tardando una eternidad. It's taking forever. Yes, so the next morning they drove up to Aspen a lo largo de, along endless, sin fin, winding roads. There they had lunch. They had lunch in Aspen. And then Nancy took the car and drove to the house George Clooney had bought. So she left Philip in the restaurant or in the town. And she took the car and went alone. And she drove to the house George Clooney had bought. Pluscuamperfecto. Y fue. Claro que yo digo drove. He dicho muchas veces que usamos los verbos de locomoción en vez del verbo ir. En español es al revés. Fue en coche, fue conduciendo, fue andando, fue en avión, fue en tren. We say he flew. He drove. We use the movement verb. He drove, she drove, en este caso, she drove to the house George Clooney had bought. All right, where am I? Apparently, well, when she got there, cuando llegó allí, when she got there, she saw a man, with a shovel. A shovel. This is a shovel. A shovel. Una pala. Chovel. S-H-O-V en medio. Chovel. Escrito. Pronunciación. Shovel. So she saw a man. When she got there, she drove from the center of Aspen to the house. She found the house. It's this one. She parked. And she saw a man shoveling with a shovel, que hacía con la pala, clearing a path to the door. Yeah, he had a shovel, and he was clear a path. Path is sendero, vereda, senda, o camino. Clearing a path. Esto es la nieve. And you get and this is the shovel, so the man was clearing. Aquí lo hago bien, He was clearing a path to the door. Okay, she saw a man from behind. She couldn't see the man. Maybe a gardener, somebody, I don't know, was clearing the snow. To clear, como la palabra claro, transparente, pero como verbo to clear means despejar, abrir, despejando. To clear también se usa para saltar con éxito sobre una valla o sobre el listón del salto con altura. To clear the bar. When you jump, the fall's very flat. Boom. You didn't clear the bar. All right, to clear. Y el gálibo también is clearance, going under. El equipo del limbo, you need to go under the bar, The high jump is over the bar. The limbo is under. Limbo. To clear the bar. To clear. Well, this man was clearing the snow to make a path to the door, right? ¿Cómo lo dicen aquí? All right, let's see. When she got to the house, she saw a man with a shovel clearing a path to the front door through the snow. A través de la nieve. The man didn't notice that Nancy had arrived. He was busy working. He didn't hear Nancy arrive. He didn't hear her. He didn't hear her arrive. He didn't notice she had arrived. Okay. As she walked up, conforme se acercaba, caminando, dos letritas, mientras se acercaba, a medida que se acercaba, según se acercaba, as she walked up to the man, to walk up to es acercarse a alguien andando. As she walked up to the man along the path that he had cleared, she asked him if Mr. Clooney was in. Excuse me, is Mr. Clooney in? And apparently she scared him. Un sobresalto. He didn't hear anybody. He was busy, and she came up from behind him. She walked up to him from behind and said, excuse me, is Mr. Clooney in? Is Mr. Clooney, George Clooney, is Mr. Clooney in, means en casa. ¿Está el señor Clooney? Is Mr. Clooney in? And it startled him. To startle is asustar de un sobresalto. No por miedo, simplemente una sorpresa. That's a startle. También scare. Me has asustado. You scared me. To scare. Escrito scare. Yes. As she walked up to the man along the path he had cleared, she asked him, le preguntó, she asked him, fíjate cómo yo la acá de ask. She asked him. Yo digo she asked him. She asked him if Mr. Clooney was in. Al parecer, apparently, she scared him because he was so busy clearing the snow that he hadn't heard her come up to him from behind. He was so busy clearing the snow that he hadn't, pluscuamperfecto de nuevo, aquí hay mucho, he hadn't heard her. No la había oído acercarse desde atrás. He hadn't heard her come up, dice aquí, ¿no? He hadn't heard her, ¿qué es lo? Come up to him, acercarse a él, come up to him from behind, desde atrás, from behind. All right. When he turned around, he smiled and said, yes. She said, excuse me, is Mr. Clooney in? Yes. He turned around and said, yes. Nancy stood frozen. To stand is estar de pie, pero past tense, stood. Se quedó de pie ahí, paralizada, congelada, helada, frozen. It was George Clooney himself. That's George Clooney. Yeah. From behind. It was George Clooney himself. Nancy, she had thought the man was a gardener or something similar. She had thought, otro pluscuamperfecto, había pensado que era jardinero o algo similar. She thought it was a gardener. She thought the man was a gardener or something similar. All she could manage to say was, all she could manage to say was her name. My name is, hi, I'm Nancy Johnson. All she could manage to say, lo único que podía lograr decir es su nombre. She was so surprised. All she could manage to say, manage. Manage es gestionar una empresa, por ejemplo, to manage. Manage también es dirigir, pero manage también es lograr, cuando va seguido otro verbo. Lograr decir. Todo lo que logró decir, lo único que logró decir era su nombre. All she could manage to say was her name. Apparently, Mr. Clooney was used to this, and he smiled and invited her into the house to have a coffee. So, apparently, George Clooney was used to this. Está acostumbrado a esto. People say, wow, George Clooney. He was used to it. He was accustomed to it. Apparently, Mr. Clooney was used to it, and he smiled and invited her into the house to have a coffee. Said, let's go inside. Entremos. Let's go inside and have a coffee. Does that sound okay? Yeah, yes. Okay. Apparently, Mr. Clooney was used to this and smiled and invited her into the house. La invitó para ir dentro de la casa. He invited her into the house to have a coffee. When Nancy went into the house, she immediately realized, wow, se dio cuenta. She immediately, doble M, she immediately realized that no one had lived there for a long time. It was cold, dirty, and empty. The house was cold, big house, a beautiful old house, but it was cold, dirty, and empty. A lo mejor había fantasmas. Maybe there were ghosts. They went into the kitchen. Where Mr. Clooney had an electric heater on. You know, these little electric heaters on the floor, because it's very cold. All right? Where he had electric heater on. All right? And, ¿dónde estoy? I've lost my place. Let's see. She immediately realized that no one had lived there for a long time. It was cold, dirty, and empty. They went into the kitchen where Mr. Clooney had an electric heater on. He poured her a coffee. To pour, verter, de echar café a la taza. En inglés decimos verter, to pour. Suena casi igual que pobre, no pour. To pour, P-O-U-R. He poured coffee. He poured her, le echó un café, le dio un café. He poured her a coffee and one for himself. All right, the musical cup. He poured her a coffee and one for himself. Okay. And they sat down at, I'm sitting at the table. I'm leaning on the table. I'm sitting at the table. Okay. And they sat down at an old wooden table. This isn't an old wooden table. This table is formica? Yeah, maybe. Conglomerado con formica or con, I don't know. This isn't an old wooden table. But they sat down at an old wooden, de madera, wooden table. All right, one of the table legs was shorter than the other three. And the table kept moving whenever either one of them leaned on it. Yeah. ¿Me puedo calzar la mesa, por favor? You say the camarero. Huh? ¿Me calza la mesa? Está. Yeah. The table is unstable. And here this wooden table was unstable. One leg was shorter than the other three of this old wood. You can imagine Nancy Johnson in a strange old house with strange smell with George Clooney in a kitchen, an electric heater, an old wooden table that is unstable, and a coffee. And George Clooney is sitting on the opposite side of the table. And anytime one, Nancy or George Clooney, leaned on the table, all right? It's a strange, you can imagine the scene. All right. However, Nancy didn't realize it. Nancy was thinking about George Clooney and thinking about the house. And the table, she didn't realize the table was unstable. She was thinking about her hair. She was thinking about her hair and her clothes. You know, she's sitting in front of George Clooney. Now, Mr. Clooney was wearing a pair of old blue jeans, viejos vaqueros. He was wearing un par de viejos vaqueros. Decimos par de pantalones en inglés. No dice un pantalón. Aquí se dice, oye, ¿qué pantalón llevo hoy? Yeah. Voy a llevar un pantalón gris. I'm going to, no, a pair of trousers. A pair of trousers or a pair of pants? Americanos, a pair of pants, más que a pair of trousers. But he was wearing a pair of jeans, old blue jeans, viejos vaqueros. He was wearing a pair of old blue jeans and a flannel shirt, Camisa de franela, claro, aquí en España los pijamas. Los pijamas son de franela. Pero hay muchos. In America, a lot of people. The weather's very cold in the winter in the United States. And a lot of people wear flannel shirts with a T-shirt, camiseta debajo. They wear flannel shirts. So George Clooney was wearing a pair of old blue jeans and a flannel shirt. He didn't seem to care about anything. He didn't seem to care about the weather, about the table. He didn't seem to care about anything. All right, one more time. Well, let me recapitulate. Last Friday, well, they took the day off. They took Friday off, which means they left on Friday morning early to drive to Denver because it took them 9 hours to drive to Denver. So if they left at 9 o'clock in the morning, then they got to Denver at 6 p.m. But probably stopped along the way for gasoline and to have lunch. So they probably got to Denver around 7 p.m. or 7:30. They left in the morning. On a Friday, Philip took the day off from the bank, and Nancy took the day off from the technical college where she teaches interior decoration. Or she found a substitute. And they drove across Nebraska, across half of Colorado, to the city of Denver. And there they stopped to spend the night, to have dinner, and to spend the night in the Marriott Hotel. Very good. The next morning, they drove up along winding roads, endless winding roads, to the small town, to the town of Aspen. When they got to Aspen, they had lunch. And then when they finished lunch, Nancy took the car, and Philip stayed in the center of the town. And Nancy drove to George Clooney's house. When she got there, she parked. She noticed a man clearing a path to the door, from the street to the door, because it had snowed a lot. It was cold. And he was clearing the snow with a shovel, shoveling snow, okay? And she approached him from behind. She came up to him from behind. He didn't notice her. He didn't hear her arrive. He was busy paying attention to the snow and to his job of clearing a path to the door. And she said, "Excuse me, is Mr. Clooney in?" And it startled him. It surprised him. It scared him. He wasn't expecting a person to come up behind him and say something. But he turned around and smiled. And he said, "Yes." And she was shocked. She stood frozen because it was George Clooney himself, you see. And she finally was able to say, "Hello, my name, I'm Nancy Johnson." Ah, and so he said, "Well, would you like to come in for a coffee?" So he invited her in to the house. He invited her into the house. He invited her in. To the house, si quiero dejarla fuera. He invited her in to have a coffee. But the only room that was warm was the kitchen, because the house was very big. So it was very cold, dirty, and clearly very empty. And they went to the kitchen. And there was an old wooden table in the kitchen, unstable because one leg was shorter than the other three. One leg, pata. Decimos pierna. La pierna, pata, it's the same. Una pata era más corta. One of the legs was shorter than the other three. And George Clooney had some coffee ready, hot coffee, American-style coffee. And he said, "Please have a seat." And he poured her a coffee, and he poured one for himself. And they sat down at the table to talk about the future, of course, to talk about the decoration of the house. And of course, she was thinking about her hair. ¿Está bien mi pelo? Am I making a good impression? on George Clooney. But he was not, he didn't care about anything. He was wearing a pair of blue jeans, old blue jeans, de los medio rotos, no? Like torn blue jeans, and a flannel shirt. All right. And the table, every time George Clooney or Nancy Johnson leaned on the table, it moved. But she didn't notice it, and he didn't care. And that was the first time that Nancy Johnson met George Clooney. You can see it here. Nancy Johnson, how much time? How much time do we have? Very little. Oof, very little time. So I spent the entire hour, the entire class talking about Nancy Johnson and George Clooney and her husband Philip. She's going to start decorating his home. Philip will return to Lincoln, Nebraska, but Nancy will stay a couple of days more. All right. I'll see you tomorrow.